Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully people aren't too tired right after lunch, but we have what we hope will be an engaging panel for you on Medtech M&A. So we get to hear a lot about Medtech M&A from a corporate development perspective. Today we have an opportunity to hear from R&D leaders with experience on all sides of M&A transactions, including some more fundamental and operational considerations and perspectives. So we've segmented this out into essentially three themes: pre-deal diligence and preparation, getting the deal closed, and post-closure integration and success. So we're joined here. I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves in just a second. Ye from GE Healthcare, Tal from Genesis Medtech Group, who I saw in the gym before 6 a.m. today. Good job. Tesh from BD, and Anna from Medtronic. So, Ye, would you please introduce yourself, and please feel free to mention any notable transactions that you've participated in.
Sure. So my name is Ye Bu. I joined GE Healthcare about a year and a half ago to lead the strategy and BD for our imaging business, which is about half of GE Healthcare. Before I joined GE Healthcare, I was a Medtech M&A banker on Wall Street for about 13 years. So I have seen both worlds in terms of transaction and how it gets done. Before I got into corporate development, I was more on the large deal side. Our team was part of the St. Jude Medical sale to Abbott. And at GE, we're more focused on now at the tuck-in acquisition. So it's good to see all different kind of transactions at a different stage. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Tal.
Hey everyone, I'm Tal Wenderow. I'm a venture partner in Genesis Medtech. I've been there for 18 months. Genesis is kind of a new strategic based in Asia. Before that, the luxury of being a CEO of a company in digital health, and prior to that, founder of Corindus, that I stayed almost till the acquisition. I kind of left a couple of months before the acquisition, but saw it from both sides. And it's hard to follow the panel before us because the room is not that full, but we'll get through that.
Yeah, indeed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Teshtar Elavia, VP of R&D for surgery at Becton Dickinson. BD often mistaken as BizDev. No, BD is in Becton Dickinson. Most recently, I helped spin off the diabetes division from an R&D perspective into its own standalone company, which is Embecta. Prior to that, I led the due diligence from the perspective of being acquired by Medtronic. I worked at Covidien, and I was part of the due diligence team on the medical supplies, minimally invasive surgery side, and multiple kind of other asset acquisitions and divestitures over the year through J&J as well as Medtronic. So glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Tesh.
And hi, my name is Anna Szafranski. I am the Vice President of Marketing for the Peripheral Vascular Health business at Medtronic. While I started my career actually on the engineering and startup side, I've now been at Medtronic, Covidien Medtronic, for a little over 17 years in marketing leadership roles. I've had the opportunity to be part of the acquisition and integration teams for a number of acquisitions Medtronic has done, starting with cryocath and ablation frontiers on our atrial fibrillation side, Saffion, which is the venous seal product we sell for superficial venous disease, and more recently I led the integration of Avenue Medical into Medtronic. They are the innovators of a minimally invasive percutaneous fistula creation technology for dialysis patients.
Wow. Thank you. And I recently learned that you're active in Medtech Women's Organization, so I want to give a shout out to...
Absolutely. I'm the co-chair of Medtech Women Minnesota, and we have a very active group.
Thank you. Okay, so starting with pre-deal diligence, Tesh, the first question I would ask you, and certainly everybody chime in, certainly from an entrepreneur or startup perspective, during the due diligence process, it seemed like the entire company just got turned entirely inside out, and all of our secrets were laid bare, those that we had. But from your perspective, can an acquirer learn everything it needs to know during the due diligence process? Are there surprises, or are there just certain things that you just can't learn until you take the ribbon off and open the box and see what you bought?
Yeah, I think the answer here is no. So you can't learn everything, but the good part here is you don't need to learn everything, right? I kind of view these as a little bit like the start of a courtship, right? When you're starting courtship, you want to make sure that from your perspective, you see the potential to have a long-standing alliance. And that's how I look at it is, are you able to determine in the period of time that you have a good base, a good skeleton on which you could build your house. Now, as you build that house, you may encounter surprises, you may encounter issues on your land permits and things like that, but it's important to know that the base is solid around which you can, build that house. I don't think I've been a part of any deal that has gone exactly as they etched it out, right? And there will be surprises. More specifically, the things that I look for from my perspective are, hey, has the market opportunity been clearly defined? Do you have a technical solution to capture that market opportunity? And from the last perspective, is the differentiated outcome possible with your solution, right? And if you have those three things, I think it's a great conversation starter and then a great follow-up to kind of finish your due diligence on that. But most oftentimes, the thing that is overlooked, I have a bias because I'm from R&D, but I will say that because the time is so short, most often the due diligence is more focused around the financial aspect of it. And then you kind of realize a little bit later that maybe the product is not where it should be or is not what it was claimed to be or needs more work on it.
Okay, thank you. So, Ye, I was going to ask you the same question. Are there items that are more typically overlooked that shouldn't be overlooked? And how does that inform how you compose your due diligence team and what skill sets or functional groups you involve in the diligence process?
So, when I was on banking side, we helped, coach, I would say, startups try to position for the buyers. If you're on that side, you're more thinking about, okay, what is the strategic rationale for them to buy me? Now I'm on the buyer side, we talk about risk mitigation all the time, right? It sounds different, but at the end of the day, it's really to identify the value drivers for that asset. So if you think about it, there are probably 3, not more 5 things that are critical to deliver probably 85% of the value of the asset. And then the rest probably, is good. If you can do everything perfectly, then you're going to achieve the rest. But so there are a few got-to-haves that are the key. It's different for each business. Some of the asset, you buy it for the asset, but for the technology. Some of the companies, you buy it for the channel. Some of the companies, you buy it really for whatever different things. So once you identify the value drivers, the key focus of the diligence will really try to turn every stone on the key drivers. Mm-hmm. There's always going to be something, check the boxes, but once you check the key things, it'll be a much easier conversation. I agree with, Tash here. There's always going to be something that you missed. You just hope that the thing you missed are not the key value drivers, so you can kind of mitigate it along the way. But it's also, as from the startup side, it'd be good for you guys to start thinking about what are the key things to help the strategics really to mitigate the risk if you kind of know. Because at the end of the day, you see a lot of deals, they are structured. So you're gonna, hopefully we can tie you guys, motivate you guys to stay in the game to really help us deliver the value. So on that line, so the earlier that you kind of help us think through all those things, the better.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll come back and talk about structured deals in a second. Tal, I have a question for you, and then Anna, a question for you. So, on the startup side, how do you prepare for diligence and position the company as an attractive acquisition target? Do you tailor your preparation and how you organize it based on who the prospective acquirer is, deciding kind of what to show when, and whether that depends on how well you're able to build trust with a prospective acquirer to become more and more transparent during the diligence process?
I think the short answer is yes. The long answer, transaction like that is a process, right? And you mentioned trust. The previous panel also discussed that. Just a sense of Siemens-Corindus relation. I think I met them first time in Germany in 2008. So 11 years before the transaction. and you know, and luckily most time people stay a long time in companies, so you develop those relations and you understand what they need. But I think, you know, two things. One is if you go back to the previous question, you always miss something because by definition, the startup don't know everything, right? They don't even know. If they knew everything, they don't need us to acquire them. They'll just go all the way and go public and build a full-scale organization. And whether it's the product, the adoption, the technology, the market, how do you position that? How do you sell that? So there's a lot of things they don't know. So the strategic cannot even understand that. You just need to put a leap of faith that you go in the right direction. I do believe that you have to position per company, right? Especially in medical device, there's so many players, and sometimes the buyer is not the usual buyer. It can be the imaging company, it can be the device company, it can be the Google or the Amazon that are moving, or Salesforce that is looking into digital surgery and all of that. So you never know who the buyer is, and you have to speak with everyone, and you have to tailor your pitch in a way to that specific buyer. But it's a long process, meaning.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of preparation and a lot of education along the way.
I did not say a lot of preparation. I said it's a long process. You don't have time to prepare. But.
Okay, thank you. So Anna, you know, in terms of expectation, in terms of like how long the diligence process is going to take, you know, whether it's going to be weeks or months, I imagine somewhat depends on the scope of the deal, the stage of the deal. Some things may be predictable, some maybe not. What kind of expectations do you set with your, you know, potential acquirees, and what are some of the things that can derail a due diligence and, you know, stretch it out longer than anticipated?
Absolutely, good question. So typically with the due diligence process, we want it to be a mutual opportunity for us to, both sides, to really learn valuable information that will really help us to understand how to truly value an acquisition. And also, can we really be successful in ultimately integrating that technology into our portfolio? So they certainly, in a few cases, can be relatively short, maybe 6 weeks or 2 months, but they often go quite a bit longer. And as we heard in the last panel, sometimes there's other phases. We may do our due diligence, decide it's not the right time, but then later come back and want to relook at it. But typically in a diligence process, what I'm really looking for is one, on the product side. What is the value driver of the product? What stage is it at, right? Is it very early stage? Or do the company already have products that may be commercial on the markets, let's say in Europe or in the US? The stage of the product is absolutely going to determine how deep we have to go in the rigor of our technology. We're looking at, can this product be manufactured easily, right? If it's on the market, what are the complaint rates? It's really important that we truly understand the product, the current state it's in, how much it does cost to manufacture, and do we believe we could easily bring it into our systems too. Then we're also checking out, right, what's the IP situation too. We're looking at, of course, the financials and documentation, and you just really want to make sure that you do a thorough job so that you can have just predictability. You know what you're going to get, you know that you can be successful, and then move forward in the transaction.
Fantastic. I guess one thing, another consideration would be if you're in a competitive process and you don't necessarily have the luxury of all the time that you would like to take. Tesh, what kind of stresses does that add to the process in your experience?
Well, I mean, I think from a technical perspective, it adds a lot of stress in terms of, because technical assessment is most likely the long pole in the tent, right? As Anna mentioned, you know, especially if you're an early stage startup, to validate the promise of what the startup is selling from a product perspective, from a value driver perspective, is harder than if something is already on the market. So, you know, you can't figure out whether the product is performing or not without testing it, for example, right? And you may not be in a position to do that. So then you start looking at what's the science, what's the engineering first principles behind it, do you believe it? And then I think the other promise is of how most startups come up with their valuation or their projections or the market opportunity. You know, the TAMs are, I mean, even at LSI, when we heard about all the TAMs, right? You hardly hear anybody say it's a 500 million TAM. It always starts with like 40 billion, 10 billion. And by the time you actually dissect that and you analyze it and you say, what's the true market that, you know, this product will serve? It's often maybe $1 billion or, you know, $500 million, something like that. And now you're talking about your penetration rates through that, and nobody signs up for a 50% penetration rate, right? Most often the curves that you see are all like, hey, 5 years down the line, I'll take 10%, right? So it quickly narrows it down from a technical perspective. It's hard to go in and justify that valuation that early on. But then you have to, like Tal said, take that leap of faith. Is the technology differentiated? And if commercialized or if developed correctly, maybe it takes a year or two more than what the startup is saying. But if it's developed correctly, does it have the promise to, change and disrupt the market?
One thing I want to add on that, for the process, because I used to run sell-side process all the time, right? We have a timeline saying, hey, 6 to 8 weeks first run, and 2 months second run. In order for that process to be successful, I would suggest that you get to the socialization process done before people come to the party, because it's very hard for a lot of organizations, including probably most of us on the stage, for them to actually get to understand the technology, understand the company, all the things to check within a few months. It's very difficult. So what I have seen work out better is that we used to call it socialization, but it's really you start the conversation with the potential buyers, even like sometimes half a year before you start thinking about the process, really get the teams to, try out the technology, understand the market, your value proposition, all that kind of good stuff out of the way. So when you start the process, really people focus on, okay, let's drive into the value to see, okay, everything else checked. We're really talking about how much we're going to value this asset. That will be a much better outcome, because otherwise you will put some potential buyers who are not that, who don't move that fast in a disadvantage when it comes to bid.
Yeah, excellent point. Okay, last question about diligence. Do you see a lot of variation in the quality of the preparation of the potential target companies that you look at? Should that be a surprise? And is there any predictive value in that? I mean, can a company essentially just knock itself out of consideration by being so poorly prepared that you just you get a bad omen from that?
I'd say yes. Sometimes when we go into the data room, it is very thin on information, and typically we have a checklist, right, that we're clearly looking for is what's the type of information there. If the data are a little too thin, we'll have to pause and say, listen, these are the documents that we really need in there so we can really do a thorough analysis. Other times when you go in, everything's there, and they've probably been through this before, right, and are very ready for our review, and that just makes it a lot smoother. So you're looking for, is the information we need readily available? And then when we have the conversations with the target company, how open are they with information, right? You want to really understand, too, is what they're telling you matching what's in that documentation, right? Do you believe it? Is it robust? Are you building the trust that's going to help lead you to the next stage? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think to add to Anna's point, the information that in the data room should also be believable, right? Oftentimes, I think Ramin mentioned it in the previous panel, it's really important to be honest and vulnerable about where your technology or your product in. Most oftentimes when companies actually come in and pitch hey, everything is perfect, it actually raises more alarms, and people actually then do more due diligence, like, why is there nothing wrong here? Like, I can't believe it, right? It's too good to be true. But if you can take your, potential partner on that journey with you to say, look, this is where we are today, but these are the steps we see in the interim in order to fulfill the promise that we're pitching you, I think it opens up for a more transparent win-win dialogue. And you might even get help. Like, I've been a part of, deals where the partner has come in and said, like, hey, I really need R&D's help to kind of vet this through. Can you, or I need clinical assessment, but can you do it? And then if it pans out, you will see it. And we've actually done that, right? We've invested our resources to kind of say, hey, the technology looks promising. The partner may not have the funds, or we may not have the funds to invest today, but what we can do is validate the technology through our infrastructure. And oftentimes we end up doing that, and then to Tal's point, the relationship is over a period of time. You start believing it, and then the trust factor builds.
Right,
yeah.
Great.
And one more point about that, and I think I relate to the data room. You ask about readiness and preparation from the startup experiences. You want to make sure you have a data room ready at all times. And that's the reason you need a strong CFO. And CFO is not the financing guy. It's and I had a CFO that did not know a lot about financing, but he knew how to organize the company to be ready all the time, whether it's investors, whether it's strategic, because I switched sides. I was in startup, now in a strategic. One thing I underappreciated is the momentum of a deal. And, you know, we see so many deals right now. You probably see much more than me. And the team move on if the company is not ready. And you have to be ready in a very reliable, transparent way. And also, you know, from a startup guy, the thought is, are you a one-stop shop, meaning I'm selling one company, I'm done, and I'm retiring? Or if you want to do more and more, no one will come back to you if you're lying or you're not telling the truth. So you want to be honest, transparent, because hopefully you'll work with these guys for a long time and you keep meeting them at LSI and all these other social events and you become friends.
I totally echo that momentum point. We used to say, time kill all deals. If you drag along, you never know what happens. That's one thing. Another thing is that, you know, as we probably all feel like that, right? The longer you're in this medtech industry, the smaller you feel like the social circle is. You bump into people. So reputation is really important. And also another thing is that people are by nature, they're sometimes emotional, right? If you're not prepared and then the question marks start to build in people's mind. That all will be factored into, at the end of the day, is their consideration to whether put in the bid or how much they value the company.
And just two things to add, too. One, to reiterate, we're not looking for perfection. Two, right? We realize at Medtronic we have a lot of resources, and the smaller companies, you're really doing your best, but we totally understand if it's you're letting us know, hey, we have a supplier of this key part, they may be not ideal, that's fine, right? Those are the type of things we can plan for and we can build in. It's more the surprises that are the problem, too. It is not just recognizing that there's some opportunity for improvement. And I'd say also in parallel, as we're in the data room, we're doing this due diligence, we're also out talking to physicians. We're trying to see cases if we can. We're really learning from them, trying to understand what the physician perspective is, and then is it then in a site of service or a channel where we can also be successful at. So I think that part is just equally important to us to determine how successful we'll be.
Perfect. So moving on to like getting the deal closed, Anna, I'm going to continue with you. Obviously, getting to a deal involves agreeing on valuation. And from an entrepreneur or startup perspective, valuation expectations, to your point, are typically pretty high, whereas an acquirer, you may take a more conservative view of things. So without revealing your secret sauce, can you talk about how you approach establishing valuation and how you, what are some of the issues you face in trying to bridge that gap with a potential target?
Exactly. There's always a gap, right? And we do anticipate that. And so the first thing we're looking at is, what is the market opportunity? We typically, if we're getting further along with a company, have already done a model. So we typically know what's the size of the market, how fast do we think it's growing, is it a market we're already in, or is it a new market we want to be in? So we're really looking at that piece first. Then we're looking at, can we execute? Do we have the sales channel, the sales team that might be calling on the right physicians or the right sites of service, or do we believe we could add that piece of it? So we're taking this top-down and bottoms-up model to come to what's the opportunity and how can we execute against that. Then it is really helpful to see the model from the target company too, because what I'm looking for is, what are their assumptions? What are they assuming about reimbursement? What are they assuming about FDA approval or enrollment in their study? And I'm trying to document those and saying, where do we match and where are we off? And when we're off, sometimes that means a milestone payment that we'll have to build into the structure. We'll say, you may think reimbursement's going to come early. We may think it's going to come a little later, so let's put a payment on that too. It's one way where you help to bridge those types of gaps.
Great. Tal, from your perspective on the other side of the table, what are your thoughts?
There's always gap and in everything in life. But the other thing is a good deal, everyone needs to leave something on the table. And otherwise, it's not a good deal, right? So I think, from the startup side, you have to realize, what's your objective? Are you trying to grow the company all the way? Or you want to sell? Do you want to flip the company? Is it a tuck-in acquisition? Is it the full-scale business unit for that franchise? And that's how the valuation comes into play. Again, startups do not think like that, right? You always think my product is the best product ever. Medtronic or BD has to have it, and if not, gee, we'll steal it because they want to go into the device, and I know better than them. And that's usually the startup mentality, and it's part of the ego mindset that you're the best, otherwise you cannot survive. Meaning, it's, you know, we all saw those 5 years forecast, $100 million revenue. And my question is all the time, show me 5 companies that reached that, and let's keep talking afterwards. No one reached that. So you just need to be realistic. And also, the previous panel spoke a lot about that, is who are your shareholders, who are your investors? Are the family office, is there strategic involved? Are there VC? What's their valuation expectation? What's their multiply? Because in the end of the day, the CEO job is to serve the shareholders, right? And not himself, not his ego, also his employees. So you have to make sure it's all matched. And sometimes a good deal is 2.5x on the table right now and not 5x in a year because you're going to create more value, but you need to bring another $40 million in. So you need to do those balances, and it's always a middle ground.
That's excellent perspective. Yeah, I've heard you say that, you know, some deals work, some deals don't work, some deals work better than others. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I would say when I said that, it's more from economic standpoint. You know, there are deals that work out better than the others. If you think about look backwards, I think it goes back to my point earlier. It's really like the key value drivers. You know, once we sign a deal, or during the negotiation stage of a deal, some people start to forget about where you're really buying, right? And then things start to feel like, okay, we're talking about numbers now. All the others don't really matter at that point. Then also, once you sign the deal, get into integration, you don't necessarily, sometimes people don't do a good job to really preserve that key value driver. For example, there are deals, especially like bigger deals, you know, if the sales rep is important, you got to figure out a way to be able to keep them to grow the revenue, right? If you kind of fail on that front, lose the sales rep, you know, 30% of the sales rep the first month, and then your value is not, you're not going to achieve the projections you actually think you are getting. And then sometimes it's, for example, as I think about now, say, hey, device company wants to buy a software company, for example, or digital IT company, and then we're going to sell the product the way that we sell devices. That's probably not going to work out very well. Sorry. So it really comes down to how, you know, how well we're able to preserve that type of value driver during the whole process. You know, for us, you know, we learned during our recent deals is that it's important to have an integration leader to be involved in the second stage of the diligence. Not necessarily say, hey, you know, you think about integration. It's really during this whole process, you kind of figure out, okay, what are the key things that I have to get it right from day one to make sure we don't screw up. So those tend to be, you know, better deals. Another thing is also from the startup side is really like we mentioned this like trust or risk price is really for us, the risk that can be mitigated is okay. It's really the risk that we cannot mitigate or we didn't have a plan to mitigate on a timely manner that gets us into trouble. Yeah.
Just to reiterate how important retention of key talent are. That is absolutely something we're looking at during the diligent process. We're asking a lot of questions because there will be key technical talent. Sometimes it's manufacturing and technical talent. And then there could be key individuals with very strong physician relationships or the ability to sell the value proposition of that product. And being able to keep those individuals through at least some portion of that integration phase is really, really critical to success. Mm-hmm.
So one additional perspective that folks here may find helpful is a few years ago, a consulting company came up with a report around pre-revenue startups that had been acquired and kind of analyzed where they were 7 years down the road from a projection when they were acquired to where they were. And it was 73% of the acquired startups were 80% less than projection. 1% were 50% above projection, and the rest were within plus or minus 10% of projection. So as larger companies, when they're looking at those deals, they have that information. They're going in with that mindset. So to your point about the valuation, or Ye's point about the economics, I think there's some data behind it, right? So people are looking at that, making their decisions also based on some of that historical information as well. So
It brings up the question in my mind about whether emotion, how emotion factors into a prospective deal, and when an acquirer, particularly a champion of a deal, is involved, whether that can interfere with having a dispassionate and disinterested diligence process and set up the potential for problems in the future.
I mean, I think it happens all the time, right? Like Tal said, everybody has an ego, right? And including ourselves, but my father always said, like, never let your ego be bigger than the ego of what you're serving. And I think that's important to remember, is ultimately you can be the most passionate, advocate of your technology, but don't let it blind you, right? If you use it positively and channel that information, like the previous panelists were saying, it can actually be constructive and guide you towards some of the changes you need to make. But if you let it blind you and you ignore the facts, I don't think you'll be very successful.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. Well, we have just under 10 minutes left. Let's move into the third or final phase of post-deal integration and success. And Tesh, I'll continue with you. One of the things we didn't really touch on are whether there are important differences between asset purchases and full-scale acquisitions, and how that influences the diligence process, the closing process, and the integration process. On its face, it would seem that asset purchases should be more straightforward, but maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a case-by-case example, right? Asset purchases are very specific efforts to complement a portfolio, to compete well against your competitors. And as such, the scope is narrower, right? But the same principles of acquisition still apply, right? Are you purchasing something that you believe you can grow in the market with? Are you purchasing the right talented team that can help enable, that outcome? Are you going to be able to use that asset, across your business, even if you have different businesses, like BD does? Sometimes you're going to say, hey, this technology not only could help peripheral intervention, but if you channel that technology and put it in surgery, it could fuel additional growth. So a lot of that depends on what the scope of the asset acquisition is. But I think the same basic principles still apply, whether you are acquiring an asset or you're divesting an asset, right?
Got it. Okay. Maybe one or two more questions. Anna, in terms of the integration process, we've been doing some work supporting post-deal integrations, and it's been a learning experience looking at the timeline required for really completing the integration, or when you would consider an integration complete. So in your experience, is this a 6-month process, a 1-year process, longer than that? These things need to be resourced, whether internally or externally. Can you just talk about what that process looks like in your experience?
Yeah, the length of time for integration clearly depends on how big it is. I was part of the Covidian Medtronic integration. I'd say that lasted a number of years, maybe still going in some places. But typically we put about a 2-year time horizon on it. And typically there's some financial reasons that we do that too. And you want to get the bulk of the company and the technology integrated within that 2-year time period. And what you're also then looking at is how to resource that, right? Mm-hmm. Because we joke at Medtronic, we bring an army in for due diligence, and then we bring an even larger army in to do the integration too. It involves a lot of people. We're going through every supplier that has a part in that product, right? For example, that requires a lot of resources and people, right? We're going through all the regulatory. And so we look at what are the jobs or roles we're going to need through the 2 years and longer. Those we may hire, right? But there's going to be many roles you need for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. That's where we'll look at using consultants or contractors or different organizations. I know we work with you on a number of acquisitions too, because you really want to find people who can come right in and hit the ground running, that they have an expertise in that area. They can come, they can do the supplier quality, for example, and then, move on to another project.
Yeah, and it's really, it's not just about integration. There's a lot of remediation, I
Yes.
guess, that goes along with it. You have, small companies that use low-volume suppliers. They may not be able to keep up with capacity. They may not be on your approved vendor list, approved supplier list. They're not qualified. That could be a pretty involved process.
Very involved.
Tesh, your experience? Or Tal, I'm sorry.
I don't have as many experiences as these guys, but I think the biggest thing that you're trying to solve and usually unsuccessful is the culture different between, and it's tied to retention, it's tied to shortcuts on the quality system that the startup can do because they don't have a legal team that's checking their, checks and balances all the time, and the startup can cut corners on the quality, on other things, on supplier lists. We are fine. We only need to get to 1,000 units. So the culture, to me, is the biggest gap, pre and post, but mainly post. And going back to what you mentioned about the growth drivers, it's tied. Because if you're hiring a team, right, and if you do acqui-hire or technology innovation, you want to keep them isolated from the big, giant quality system and even 2 or 3 years with the dotted line reporting. And there's no one good equation, and most companies, in my opinion, fail. Meaning we all saw the J&J layoff last week after a $3 billion acquisition. And to me, the culture difference and how to retain the team is the most difficult, the post-integration. And it's tied to resource, meaning I know several companies that, going back to valuation projection, the projection was higher on the sales. So the acquire thought we're going to have net revenue that I can position back to R&D innovation, but the net revenue did not arrive. And now the company says, oh, I'm short $10 million. Where do I get that resource from? So it's always, that ties together to me is the biggest one post.
Yeah. So in a cash transaction, obviously just getting to the close defines success. But in a structured deal where there's earnouts, you have to continue to be able to perform successfully within the new parent organization. Is there a way that you can assess the post-close risk in what might be anticipated to be a structured deal, and can that be mitigated during the negotiation and closing process?
I think it depends what the reason you buy the company. Is it technology or market? Market, it's in a way easier to assess because you tie that to revenue. On the technologies, how do you tie the technology milestone? You know better than I about that. I don't think there's a one solution for all of that. It's really a case by case, and understanding also what's important to the other side on the structural deal and how do you assess that risk and how do you retain those people.
Great. Okay, well, we have 1 minute left. Just want to open it up for anything we should have talked about that we didn't talk about, or any last thoughts. Yay?
No, I think we covered all the ground. One thing that I want to add is that, especially when the company start up on the valuation gap front, it's always going to, a structured deal is there because of this valuation gap. And I think one thing that I want to say is that during the whole process, there's always going to be a push, take and give. Most of the time, the deals die before it happens. It comes down to some human nature. People don't really feel they have pushed enough until say, hey, one of the parties say, hey, I'm done. And then people might come back to the table. So this whole process, back to your comments, there's emotion in there. There's all the ego and everything in there. I would say just hang there. If you do think there's a value for a deal to be made, it might not happen immediately. Sometimes it takes quite a few years to get a deal done. But if you believe in there, just hang there, and hopefully something will happen at the right time.
Great, thank you. Tal, any quick?
I'll do it quick. I think it ties to what you mentioned about emotion. People buy technologies and assets, not companies, right? It's obviously served for the company. It's all about people. So, nurture that relation and understand that it's all about the risk of making mistakes or, on the other hand, the risk to be successful. So just manage that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tesh?
Yeah, I think the one piece of advice I would give is you have a limited time in order to get your narrative straight. Make sure it's authentic, make sure it's transparent, and that goes a long way in having a conversation starter and piquing somebody's interest. Most people make their decision in the first hour of hearing the pitch deck, or maybe even less. But if that narrative is transparent, authentic, vulnerable, I think you will have a higher shot at engaging the audience.
Thank you. Anna, I'll give you the
I
last
was-
word.
I was just going to agree with be open, honest, and transparent as you're working with us, one of the strategics, and find that shared vision. At the end of the day, we're here because we want to improve the lives of patients. We're looking for those technologies that fill an unmet need and can fit successfully in our portfolio so we can execute against that and enable more patients worldwide to benefit from the great innovation that's going on here.
Fantastic. Well, please join me in thanking the panel for sharing their wisdom and for an engaging conversation.